Hello everybody, it's Jack. So today I want to talk about Blood DeathKnight, and specifically Breath of Sindragosa. So I know most of my videos have been focusing on healing, or Holy Priest, or even Legion Alpha, but recently on the weekends I've been playing Blood DeathKnight in another guild, just to kind of keep my interest in Warlords before Legion can come out. So I've really been enjoying it, and when I've been streaming I've gotten a lot of questions about how to maximize Breath of Sindragosa, and what I do to get as high of an uptime as I do, and do as much damage as I can do. So that's going to be the focus today, and maybe highlighting just some of the questions or some of the theory craft behind all that stuff. So why should you play Breath of Sindragosa to begin with? That's one question. Even though, because Defile is considerably easier to use, and what's the difference? I'm surviving the fights, I'm tanking the things, nobody's getting killed, So the biggest thing about Breath of Sindragosa is just the damage that it can deal, and even the higher mitigation. A lot of times when you're using it, it acts as like a supercharged hot, and even more so if you're tanking lots and lots of adds. Instead of having to worry about your Death Strike, your Blood Boil is actually healing you from the spell damage and from having breath applied to all those targets. You're just healing a considerable amount, and even if you're using the tank ring at the same exact time, you're healing your other tank as well. It's very, very nice. So the mitigation, the damage that you can do are huge, and in a lot of respects it's just a lot more fun. I found when you're tanking his blood and you're just using Defile, it's okay, the 10% damage reduction in Defile in a raid is, not noticeable in the slightest in a lot of ways. It's pretty noticeable in challenge modes, but that's a whole nother story. But a lot of times it's just a lot more interesting. It adds another dynamic to playing Breath and playing Blood in general, that there's a lot more that you have to think about to maximize your damage, and it's very rewarding when you do maximize your damage. So, moving on, when can you actually start playing Blood? If you're a fresh Blood Death Knight, if you're just getting into it, you're just learning, you can really play at any time, but a lot of times you need a higher level of multi-strike to actually sustain it, instead of just going, oh, I'm at like 70, 80 RP, let me push Breath, and then it just goes and ticks down to 0, like it was the second you spend all your runes, which is kind of how Unholy works. But when you play Blood and you're at 50 to 60% multi-strike, or even higher, it gets way, way easier to actually be able to sustain Breath of Sindragosa, to actually make the most damage out of Breath of Sindragosa. So, very, very strong to take once you have more. The trinkets that you're going to be using to maximize your damage, this is, again, maximizing your damage, If you're worried about mitigation, if you're worried about dying on a fight, with or without Breath of Sindragosa, you want to tank trinkets, not DPS trinkets. Just clear that up. But Violet Convulsive Shadows from Mythic Iron Maidens, most people don't have that, especially if you're a new player and you do not have that, it's okay. This is min-maxing your damage. If you do not have it, feel free to run Mythic Blackheart Foundry. It's a lot easier these days. It's considerably easier. But if not, it's okay. The Fell Cleave Trinket, which is the preferred one, which you would take over the Violet Convulsive Shadows on Cleave fights, is also very, very strong. It's still pretty strong in single target fights as well. And the Empty Drinking Horn off of Manaroth, also another very strong trinket in HFC. So, now, getting into Breath of Sindragosa, right? Here are some things like you really have to keep in mind when you're trying to maximize your breath. One of the biggest things that's actually not talked about as much is parry haste. Now, what do I mean by parry haste? Parry, like, if you stack parry, it doesn't give you more runic regen or anything like that. But what parry does is it actually speeds up your auto attacks when you're being attacked by another target. So Dancing Rune Weapon is the only ability that Blood has to actually increase its parry, besides using really old enchants that'll give you 5 more, something ridiculously small. But Dancing Rune Weapon, whenever you're being attacked by a target as Blood, and you parry the attack, you attack back immediately after. So it's kind of like you have your shield up, or your two-handed weapon up, somebody hits it against it, and you hit back really quick. And if those auto attacks multi-strike, then you gain 15 runic power, which is really, really good, which is why having more and more multi-strike will be making it easier and easier for you to actually keep up your breath. So, using Dancing Rune Weapon is extremely important when you're using your Breath of Sindragosa. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind how efficiently you're spending your resources and also not dying at the same time. Resources are like the biggest thing that we can talk about for Breath of Sindragosa. You should be taking Blood Tap, having the control over your runes, as well as talents do nothing when you're using Breath of Sindragosa, and they offer no way for you to regenerate runes unless you want a Death Coil during your Breath of Sindragosa, which is a horrible idea. Throwing that out there. So, using Blood Tap is very, very important, and before you even breathe, you want to make sure that you have a very high number of Blood Tap stacks. Usually I'm around 7 or higher. You don't want to have it too high. Off the pull, you will not have that many stacks at all, which is okay, because usually off the pull, if you're lusting considerably, you'll be auto-attacking way more, and you'll be able to generate a lot more runic power that way. But high amount of runic power, you want to have one of every rune on cooldown, because you know there's 3 sets of 2 runes each, and each of those runes is tied together. So if you have 2 blood runes, one only regens at a time, then the other one does. So if you have 2 blood runes, each is a 6-second cooldown, and they're both on cooldown, the first one regens 6 seconds later, and the other one regenerates 12 seconds later. Now when you begin your breath, it's very important, once you have that high amount of runic power, high amount of blood tap stacks, and one of every type of rune on cooldown, so they're all recharging, that's when you activate your breath, and then you kind of hold on for a second. And you want to make sure that you're watching your swing timer, and if you do not have a swing timer, I'll include my weak auras that I've been using in the description. And being able to watch not only your swing timer for when you're regenerating, but also when your swing timer skips because you parried and you attacked back faster, so you gained more runic power out of that. Because you do not want to have it so that you're either death striking or blood boiling, and you're capping out on runic power and you're wasting runic power. Sometimes it's necessary, and in a couple situations, dying or threat of dying, obviously you don't want to die as a tank. And the other one is if you're having ads that die very quickly, and you know that to maximize your damage, you need to waste a lot of runic power and runes just to be able to maximize your damage, because it's the only damage you can do in that one phase. So an example of this is Iskar. If you are on farm content for Iskar, when the ads come out, generally they're going to melt. So you want to be able to be hitting that blood boil, breathing on every single target, dealing as much damage as possible to them, even if you're capping out on runic power, because of the fact that the ads are going to be annihilated very quickly. But if you're progressing on the fight, maybe you want to be a little bit more conservative with it, because they may live considerably longer. Something to keep in mind, especially as, you know, depending on what kind of guild you're in, depending on the DPS of the raid, you know, those things are going to change a little bit. So play it by ear, but those are the 2 situations, the 2 exceptions to the rule that you can be inefficient with your resources. Otherwise, every single death strike, blood boil, all of that should be generating the maximum amount of runic power it can every single time. And you should not be capping out on runic power during breath, which can happen very easily, and a lot of that is tied into either parrying attacks, lusting off the pull, or even inefficient use of Empower Rune Weapon. That's another big one. Using Empower Rune Weapon, however, that's your last resort. You want that ability to be your last stand, your last thing that you use. Every single rune is on cooldown, you're running fairly low on runic power, and pop that, and then you're able to generate more and give you some more breathing space. A lot of times, in my experience, what will happen with Breath of Sindragosa is you'll be around 70 plus runic power. You'll be fine, you'll be back and forth, maybe you'll dip down to like 60, and then once you hit 50, 40, and you're around that range fairly consistently, that's when you're more or less in the danger zone. You need to be able to be very sharp, because if you miss an auto attack, and you're just going to start losing runic power very quickly, and you're just going to end your breath. So one way to get you out of that danger zone of sorts is AMS, and looking at every single mechanic on every single fight very, very stringently, and saying, what of these things can I AMS, and what can I soak to maximize my breath uptime? As you're seeing here, I'm trying to find every single little fight I can, starting with Zakun soaking the pools with AMS up, going on to Iskar's massive Kamehameha blast that I'm AMSing, going into Council's Fell Spin from Blade Master Jupithis, and then finally the pools on Gorefiend, or even the feast on Gorefiend. All these things can be runic power soaked, and should be soaked during your breath to maximize this uptime, maximize your runic power regeneration, and max your damage, really. These things can make a huge difference, and a lot of times they can even be the perfect time for when to mitigate damage. Is when you're getting a lot of damage coming at you, instead of having to Death Strike or instead of having to spend runes inefficiently, well, you just AMS soak it, and then you don't have to worry about it. A side note, a very small side note. Whenever you're soaking absorbs, the priority system for how absorbs are soaked is the smallest absorb first. So when you're playing Blood, usually your AMS is like 1,000,000-ish, sometimes higher. So having somebody spamming cow on you, for instance, and I've had this happen on Zolorak before, it will make it so that your entire Void Strike could just get absorbed, and you get no RP from it. So something to keep in mind. I have another weak aura in the description that'll let you track the total amount of absorbs on you, and that'll be something that you can kind of think in mind, and you can kind of yell at your Disc Priest a little bit about that. All those things and being very efficient with your runes, very efficient with your runic power, and very efficient with your blood tap stacks, a lot of times you're going to face situations where you will be in danger of dying or the potential of dying from other kind of raid mechanics while you still need to be conservative. So external cooldowns and your own cooldowns. Things like Dancing Rune Weapon are oftentimes reserved for your breath to maximize the uptime, as is your tankering. So you have a very big safety window at the start of your breath, but what about later on when maybe you're low on runes, you're low on runic power, and powered rune weapons on cooldown? This is where making use of Vamp Blood, Death Pact, Icebound Fortitude, other healers' external cooldowns, Health Pot, Bonus Armor Pot, and Rune Tap, all are just gigantic. So having something to track external cooldowns, very important, and that's just a tanking thing in general, that if you do not do that, I would highly recommend doing that. But even more so if you're in a situation where you're trying to maximize your damage without dying. For tanks, it can be a very fine line to ride, and a lot of times it's getting comfortable with it and maybe even some trial and error on progression. But when you're able to maximize that damage, it can make a considerable difference. For instance, for our Mythic Archimon progression on my DeathKnight, being able to use Breath of Sindragosa and 2 DPS trinkets was gigantic. It was gigantic for being able to survive the Death Caller when it was on me, and for brief periods where I had the boss and the Death Caller on me, and for actually pushing 1 Doomfire with the Valor upgrades. These things made a considerable difference, and having every little bit of damage, especially tank DPS, can be a considerable deal. So of course, if you guys like the video and have suggestions for other videos, I'd be more than happy to. And let me know what you guys think in the comments and stuff. So, hope you find it useful, and I'll see you all on the live stream. Go on.